some disagreements, and some jail time today on another episode of the Bible in 1 Year with the Preacher's Husband. Today we're going through Acts chapter 15 and 16. Tomorrow we're going to go through Galatians chapter 1, 2, and 3. So let's dive into this and see what we get. So there are disputes, and more disputes going on in chapter 15 here. So we start out in verse 1. Some men came down from Judea and began to teach the brothers, unless you are circumcised according to the custom prescribed by Moses, you cannot be saved. After Paul and Barnabas had engaged them, and they were unable to reach an agreement on this issue, Paul and Barnabas were sent to the elders in Jerusalem. Now this is a sign that the Jerusalem church, with its apostles and its elders, was still the center of the Christian movement that was going on at the time. Now, on the way to Jerusalem, Paul and Barnabas shared details about the conversion of the Gentiles with believers in Phoenicia and Samaria, creating great joy among the brothers and sisters. Now, though the Pharisees here, which included Paul, because he was a Pharisee at one time, had opposed Jesus bitterly, some had become believers, like Paul. In this case, a group of them failed to understand the freedoms that Christ had won for believers, because clearly they were not tied to this old law like the Jews were tied to the old law. Correct? Correct. So, we move on from there. We get to verse 6, this Jerusalem council, right? And the central issue of the Jerusalem council was whether Gentile Christians had to be circumcised and keep the law of Moses. Especially since they were never Jews to begin with, they wouldn't have had that. They would have not been circumcised because they were never, only Jews were. So Peter reminded his hearers of four things here. God had chosen him to proclaim the gospel to the Gentiles. Number 2, the Gentiles believed Peter's message. Number 3, when the Gentiles believed, they received the Holy Spirit. And number 4, the pattern of Gentile conversion was the same as for Jewish believers. God was making no ethnic distinctions in building his church as we went on. So in light of this, the believers from the party of the Pharisees were testing God and putting on Gentile converts a burden that neither the Jewish ancestors nor contemporary Jews were able to bear. So they had this burden of having to go and be circumcised when they're adults trying to convert, where the Jews, they didn't have this problem because they were circumcised as kids when they were born. And I mean, they didn't have to go through all the pain and the agony. Didn't have this. This was a burden that they're lumping on Gentiles that was not lumped on Jews because it happened at different times. So as a leader in the Jerusalem church, James, the brother of Jesus, steps up here and he assessed the claims and the counterclaims of everything that was going on. And James cited the prophets Amos. He quoted from Amos chapter 9, verses 11 and 12, and Isaiah chapter 45, verse 21, to show that God had long ago foretold that Gentiles would be called by his name. So they go through this entire process of trying to figure out what they're going to do and how they're going to do it and what the ruling's going to be on this. So Judas and Silas, both leading men among the brothers in Jerusalem, accompanied Paul and Barnabas back to Antioch in order to vouch for, both personally and via hand-delivered letter, the results of the Jerusalem council and all that they had decided. Now, the letter here not only conveyed the findings of the council, but also commended the ministry of Barnabas and Paul, basically telling them that, no, you guys don't have to be circumcised. You don't have to go through this. So the letter was actually an encouragement to the church at Antioch because it endorsed the strategy of Paul and Barnabas in evangelizing Gentiles, and it did not impose unnecessary burdens on these new converts. So, Paul and Barnabas are getting ready to go again. They're deciding here in verses 36 through 41. It says, after some time had passed, Paul said to Barnabas, hey, let's go back and visit the brothers and sisters in every town where we have preached the word of the Lord and see how they're doing. Barnabas wanted to take along John Mark, but Paul insisted that they should not take along this man who had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not gone on with them to the work. They had such a sharp disagreement that they parted company And Barnabas took Mark with him and sailed off to Cyprus. But Paul chose Silas, and he departed after being commended by the brothers and sisters to the grace of the Lord. He traveled through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. So, that Paul and Barnabas parted ways over John Mark shows that even with apostolic fellowship, perfect unity was not always obtainable. Sometimes God's workers have to agree to just go separate ways. This is kind of like what happens when denominations split. This is kind of the evident. This is the same similar disagreement that we come to when we have disagreements over anything that's biblical, anything that has to do with, like baptisms, for instance, and can way we take communion, and can women preach, and just many, many different things that we do differently in each denomination. For instance, like in baptism, the Baptists say you got to be immersed. Other denominations say, well, yeah, you can be immersed, but you can also have water poured over you as long as it's covering your body, right? And then others, like the Methodists, like I'm a Methodist, says that we will baptize you any which way you want. You can be immersed, you can be poured, you can be sprinkled. We'll do all three, whichever you get, whatever you prefer, because it's just an outward expression of what's happening inside your heart, right? So all the denominations are split, and then those denominations are split, and there's disagreements all the time. It is inevitable. We are going to disagree. And clearly, Paul and Barnabas disagreed on taking John Mark. Why? Well, we don't know exactly, but Paul looked at John Mark as a deserter, that he was not loyal, he was not reliable, he wasn't faithful to the cause, was basically what he was insinuating here. And Barnabas was basically saying that, well, maybe we should forgive this guy and give him another chance. He was related to Barnabas, so he's kind of leaning more towards the forgiveness, and let's bring this guy along and let's go, because John Mark was actually the writer of the Gospel of Mark, right? Later on that we find out, which is probably about 4 or 5 years from now, where we are in the Bible. Mark ends up writing the book of Mark. So what it really boils down to is priority of principles. You get that? Priority of principles. Now, to Paul, clearly in this instant, the principles of loyalty and reliability and faithfulness to the cause were higher in his priority list than forgiveness, right? Barnabas would put this forgiveness and giving people second chances and third chances and fourth chances and on and on and on as a higher priority than loyalty or reliability or these other things that Paul looked at. And honestly, when I look at it, neither one of these disciples were wrong. Both of those sets of principles are great principles. It's just a matter of which one they put before the others in their priority list, which caused basically this split to happen in the teachers at that point. So I may do a longer video at some point about this and get into more details about the ifs, ands, or buts about all this stuff. But for now, we're going to move on. So, rather than going to Cyprus and strengthening the believers there, Paul and Silas went to Syria in the region of Cilicia, entering the province of Asia Minor. So, we get to chapter 16 at this point, enters a new character. And Paul went to Derbe and Lystra, where there was a disciple named Timothy, the son of a believing Jewish woman. But his father was a Greek. How interesting is that? So, Paul and Silas, they continued to retrace the first missionary journey, as Paul said he was going to, by re-entering Galatia. At Lystra, Paul invited a young man named Timothy, who was now a disciple, son of a Jewish woman and a Greek man, to join him. Paul circumcised Timothy, not because he was caving into the pressure from the believers who belonged to the party of the Pharisees, but rather to show respect for Jewish law and identity, given the fact that Timothy was half Jewish. Now, if Timothy had remained uncircumcised, it probably would have seemed to many Jews that he had rejected not just the Mosaic law, but also his Jewish ethnicity as well. So Paul's continuing mentorship of Timothy throughout his ministry resulted in, among other things, the actual writing of the letters from Paul to Timothy. So 1st and 2nd Timothy as books in the Bible. So Paul and his ministry partners conveyed the decisions about the apostles and the elders in Jerusalem about circumcision and Gentile converts. Now, Paul wanted to make it clear that Gentiles could believe in Jesus without adhering to all of those Jewish rites that came and weighted down the Jews. So that was kind of a relief, wasn't it? So in a vision, Paul sees this Macedonian man plead with him to cross over the Aegean Sea to Europe and help him. So it seems that Paul was being restricted from preaching in other places because God kept planning for him to go preach the gospel somewhere else, and that was in Macedonia. So what's he do? He loads up and he goes. Now there's a section about Lydia's conversion, and then Paul and Silas end up getting thrown into prison. Well, they were accused of causing civil disorder and promoting customs that were not legal among the Romans. Now, the practice of variant religion was not illegal in the Roman Empire, but any activity, religious or otherwise, that risked sparking civil unrest was frowned upon. So the chief magistrate acted rashly under the influence of this crowd, kind of similar to the rashness of the crowd when Jesus was suffering under Pontius Pilate, as we call it. And Paul and Silas were stripped, they were beaten, they were thrown into jail before the charges against them could even be investigated. So there was no trial. They were just beaten, stripped, and thrown into prison. Now, in verses 25 through 27 here, it says that Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, right? The prisoners were listening to him. Suddenly there was such a violent earthquake that the foundations of the jail were shaken, and immediately all the doors were opened and everyone's chains came loose. When the jailer woke up and saw the doors of the prison standing open, he drew his sword and was going to kill himself since he thought the prisoners had escaped. So, here's the thing, if prisoners had escaped, their Roman guards or their jailers were forced to serve their sentences. We've talked about this in a previous video. Now, believing that the prisoners had escaped, the Philippian jailer here preferred a quick death over imprisonment or even execution, depending on what their sentence would have been. So the jailer asked the most important question in the book of Acts right here, and that is, what must I do to be saved? Well, Paul and Silas had a very direct answer for his straightforward question. Believe in the Lord Jesus and you'll be saved, you and your household. Wait, so all I got to do is believe and be saved and my whole household's going to be saved too? Well, kinda. Household baptism is actually mentioned several times in the book of Acts. Now, it never really states who exactly was involved in such baptisms, such as were all the little babies baptized right along with the adults, or was everybody baptized in this household baptism that was to happen, or was it just the ones that professed faith in Jesus? Well, the Bible doesn't really specify. It just every now and then there may be a question that alludes to the possibility that maybe kids weren't baptized, but maybe they were. But never does it really say that I've found so far. And all my digging, I've still not found where it says, don't baptize a baby. I ain't seen that. Ain't in there that I found. So, anyway, my family, of course, my oldest, he was, we did not baptize him as an infant. We waited until he went through confirmation to decide for himself that he wanted to be baptized. But then our other two children, we had them baptized as infants. We kind of changed our ideas on baptism along the way. So we've made both decisions for our children, and when it comes to that, we've let one decide, and we went ahead and decided for the other two. But of course, they're going to be able to decide for themselves as they go through confirmation as well, whether they re-up that and say, yes, I do recognize my baptism, and go through that. So let's move on from here. Baptism for the jailer and all of his family that followed almost immediately upon their profession of faith in the Lord. And Paul knew the laws regulating punishment of Roman citizens. He knew them quite well because he was a Roman citizen, and having been illegally beaten and denied a trial, he refused to be released and pretend that nothing happened, because Paul's Roman citizenship is mentioned here for the very first time in Acts chapter 16, verse 37. Now, Roman citizens were exempt from certain kinds of punishment, for example, crucifixion. maybe even this beating, and they were actually entitled to a due process prior to being punished, which didn't happen here at all. So even the magistrate could have gotten in serious trouble here. And the fear of the magistrate is pretty understandable, since he could have ended up being in a serious mess himself. So, I hope this has helped you in your studies tonight. If it has, click that like button and subscribe button. Click the little jingle bell so you get notified next time I upload a video. And if you're rumbling with me on Rumble, hit that little boxing glove. And we'll see you again tomorrow for another episode of the Bible in 1 Year with the Preacher's Husband. We'll see you then.